My name is Crix Tal, and I honestly thought I was going to die that day. Not from some cosmic disaster or space plague, mind you, but from sitting 3 seats away from a genuine, certified Deathworlder. You know, one of those terrifying humans everyone whispers about in the dormitory halls after lights out. The Centauri Educational Complex was supposed to be the safest place in the galaxy. Seriously. We had force fields that could stop a meteor, security drones that could detect a hostile thought from parsecs away, and enough redundant safety systems to make a Kothari engineer weep with joy. The brochure literally said, "Where young minds flourish in perfect harmony," which sounds lovely until you realize they let a human enroll. Maya Thompson. That was her name. She sat there in the 3rd row, looking about as dangerous as a wilted flower. Short brown hair, average height by human standards, which meant she towered over most of us like some kind of gentle giant. The professors had given her one of those reinforced desks, the kind they usually reserved for the rock-eating Gorlaxians, because apparently humans could accidentally destroy furniture just by existing. The rest of us kept stealing glances at her throughout Professor Quindara's lecture on peaceful conflict resolution. Oh, the irony there. Maya just sat quietly, taking notes with this ancient human writing instrument called a pencil, occasionally nodding along like she wasn't a walking weapon of mass destruction from the most violent planet in known space. Tikri, my Zephonian roommate, had spent the entire morning explaining human horror stories to anyone who would listen. How they survived on a world where everything, including the weather, actively tried to murder them daily. How they hunted predators that could snap a Valerian in half just for fun. How they actually enjoyed recreational combat sports where they hit each other in the face repeatedly. Looking at Maya, though, I had my doubts. She seemed more interested in her quantum mechanics homework than plotting our demise. She even smiled politely when Professor Quindara made one of his terrible jokes about molecular bonding. A real killer would never laugh at something that bad. But then again, everyone knew that humans were masters of deception. Maybe this quiet, studious act was just part of their predatory nature. Maybe she was analyzing our weaknesses, planning the most efficient way to eliminate the entire class. I shifted nervously in my seat, my 3 hearts beating slightly faster than normal. Just being in the same room as a Deathworlder felt like tempting fate itself. Then the universe decided to prove me absolutely, terrifyingly right. The invasion klaxon shrieked through the facility like a banshee with anger management issues. Red warning lights bathed everything in the color of fresh blood, which seemed oddly appropriate given our current company. The automated voice began its cheerful announcement. Attention students and faculty. We are experiencing a Code Crimson security breach. Please remain calm while we all panic internally. Okay, it didn't actually say that last part, but you could hear it in the system's digital voice. Professor Quindara's 6 eyes went wide as dinner plates. Tikri started hyperventilating through both sets of respiratory slits. The Gorlaxian twins began that low rumbling sound they made when stressed, which honestly sounded like a construction site having an argument with itself. Emergency force fields slammed down over the windows with a sound like thunder. Glass doors began sealing corridors. Security drones zipped past our classroom window, their weapon systems already charging with ominous blue light. The facility's defensive grid was coming online, and everyone knew what that meant. We were under attack. But here's the thing nobody prepared me for. The moment that alarm sounded, Maya Thompson transformed. Not literally, thank the cosmos, but she went from quiet student to something else entirely. Her head snapped up, eyes scanning the room with predatory focus. Every muscle in her body tensed like a coiled spring. And then she stood up. The reinforced desk, that supposedly indestructible piece of furniture designed to withstand a small explosion, split clean in half, just from her hands gripping the edges as she pushed herself upright. The metal groaned, the composite material cracked, and 2 perfectly functional desk halves clattered to the floor like broken dreams. 27 pairs of alien eyes stared at the destruction in absolute, bone-deep terror. Maya looked around at our horrified faces and said, quite calmly, sorry about that. Sorry? Sorry? The Deathworlder had just demonstrated that she could casually destroy military-grade furniture with her bare hands, and she was apologizing like she'd accidentally sneezed too loudly during a library study session. That's when the real panic started. Tikri shrieked like a tea kettle achieving sentience and immediately regretting it. The Gorlaxian twins dove under their desks, which was honestly impressive considering they weighed about 3 tons each. A group of Zinthari students started that high-pitched whistling sound that meant either extreme fear or mating season, and frankly, I didn't want to know which. Everyone remained calm. Professor Quindara shouted over the chaos, his tentacles flailing in what was supposed to be a soothing gesture but looked more like he was trying to conduct an orchestra of terrified animals. The human is just experiencing a stress response. It's perfectly natural for their species. Natural? Natural? What kind of species considers furniture destruction a natural stress response? Maya took a step forward, probably trying to help, and half the class scrambled backward like she was carrying some kind of plague. Which, given human reputation, she very well might have been. Her hands were raised in what I later learned was a peaceful gesture. But at the time it looked like she was preparing to grab the nearest student and demonstrate her species' famous bone-crushing abilities. "Look, I can explain," Maya said, her voice remarkably calm for someone who'd just revealed herself as an instrument of mass destruction. Humans have what we call an adrenaline response when we perceive danger. It makes us temporarily stronger, and I wasn't expecting it to kick in quite so dramatically. Adrenaline response. They had a name for it. They had a biological system specifically designed for becoming more dangerous when threatened. Because of course they did. "Stay back," squeaked Plixnar, a tiny Meepian who probably weighed less than Maya's left shoe. "We know what humans do to other species. We've seen the documentaries." "Those weren't documentaries," Maya said, looking genuinely confused. "Those were action movies. They're fiction, entertainment. We don't actually go around fighting aliens for sport." But nobody was listening anymore. The alarm was still wailing, red lights were still flashing, and we had a confirmed Deathworlder in our classroom who had just proven she could break things with her bare hands. The logical conclusion was obvious. The invasion was probably her backup arriving to collect the survivors. Professor Quindara was frantically tapping his communication device, probably calling for security, or possibly for a priest. Maya stood in the middle of the chaos, looking like she wanted to help but was afraid to move in case she accidentally destroyed something else. Which, given her track record, was a very reasonable fear. Then the real monsters showed up, and suddenly Maya's furniture-destroying abilities seemed like the least of our problems. The explosion that rocked the eastern wing felt like someone had decided to rearrange the facility's architecture using large quantities of military-grade explosives. The reinforced walls, those supposedly impenetrable barriers that could withstand a direct hit from a plasma cannon, crumbled like stale cookies in a toddler's hands. Through the smoke and debris came the Zephyrian raiders, and let me tell you, they made Maya look about as threatening as a particularly aggressive houseplant. These weren't your average space pirates looking to steal lunch money and data crystals. Zephyrians were professional killers, 8 feet of pure muscle and bad intentions wrapped in armor that cost more than most planets' annual defense budgets. Their energy weapons hummed with enough power to vaporize a small moon, and their bio-enhancement modifications made them faster, stronger, and significantly more interested in violence than any reasonable species should be. The first raider through the breach took one look at our classroom and smiled. Well, I assume it was a smile. Hard to tell with all those teeth. The educational facility secured, he announced in that guttural Zephyrian accent that made every word sound like a threat. The beginning harvest of intellectual assets. Intellectual assets. They were talking about us like we were crops ready for picking. Professor Quindara, bless his academic heart, stepped forward with all the authority his tenure could muster. "Now see here, this is a neutral educational institution protected by 17 different galactic treaties." The raider's response was to shoot him with a neural disruptor. Our professor collapsed like a marionette whose strings had been cut by a particularly vindictive puppeteer. He wasn't dead, thankfully, just temporarily disconnected from his own nervous system, but the message was crystal clear. Treaties were apparently optional. More raiders poured through the breach, their scanners sweeping the room. They were cataloging us, deciding who was worth keeping and who was excess inventory. The security drones that had seemed so impressive moments earlier were nothing more than expensive scrap metal scattered across the corridors. The facility's defensive grid hadn't just failed, it had been systematically dismantled by beings who considered galactic standard military technology to be roughly equivalent to children's toys. That's when I noticed Maya again. While the rest of us were frozen in terror, staring at our imminent doom with the kind of helpless fascination usually reserved for watching traffic accidents, Maya was doing something completely different. She was studying them. Her eyes tracked their movements, noted their weapons, analyzed their formation and tactics with the kind of cold, calculating precision that made my spine tingle with premonition. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't doing any of the perfectly reasonable things that civilized beings do when confronted with overwhelming force. Instead, she was tilting her head slightly, like she was listening to music none of us could hear. Her breathing had steadied, her posture had shifted into something that looked casual but felt dangerous, and there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there during Professor Quinn Dara's quantum mechanics lecture. Something that made me realize we'd been worried about the wrong predator all along. The Zephyrian scanning our little group paused when his instruments focused on Maya. His expression shifted from professional indifference to genuine confusion. Anomalous readings, he muttered to his squad leader. This one's biology doesn't match the database. Oh, I thought with growing dread you have no idea. What happened next completely redefined my understanding of the phrase educational experience. The Zephyrian squad leader gestured for his scanner operator to investigate the anomaly, identify the species and assess threat level, he ordered, because apparently even professional killers like to follow proper procedure. That's when Maya moved. I'd heard stories about human combat before, wild tales of berserker rages and impossible feats of strength, but nobody had mentioned their talent for weaponizing absolutely everything within arm's reach. Maya grabbed what remained of her broken desk, not the whole thing, just a jagged piece of composite metal about the size of a dinner plate, and hurled it at the nearest raider with enough force to embed it 3 inches deep in his chest armor. The raider staggered backward, staring down at the makeshift projectile sticking out of his torso like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Neither could I, honestly. But Maya was just getting started. She snatched up Professor Quinn Dara's holographic projector, yanked out some kind of internal component that sparked ominously, and threw it at the squad leader's weapon. The resulting electrical feedback sent blue lightning dancing across his energy rifle until it overloaded with a sound like an angry god having a temper tantrum. Impossible, the squad leader snarled, drawing a backup weapon. No species can calculate trajectory and electrical interference simultaneously under combat stress. Maya's response was to grab a standard-issue classroom chair, break off one of its legs with a casual twist that made my secondary stomach clench in sympathetic pain, and use it as a club to smash the targeting computer on another raider's weapon array. Then she spun around and used the same chair leg to trigger the emergency fire suppression system, flooding the room with flame-retardant foam that made visibility roughly equivalent to trying to see through a bowl of soup. The raiders, trained for conventional warfare and equipped with sensors designed to track normal movement patterns, suddenly found themselves fighting something that didn't follow any known tactical doctrine. Maya moved through the foam like it was her natural environment, appearing behind one raider to disable his communications gear, then vanishing before he could react. Only to pop up on the other side of the room to turn a portable whiteboard into some kind of impromptu shield and bludgeon combination. What is this thing? One raider screamed, trying to track a target that apparently understood the precise acoustics of enclosed spaces well enough to use sound as a weapon. Maya had somehow turned the classroom's public address system into a feedback loop that made everyone except her grab their heads in pain. But the most terrifying part wasn't her improvised weapons or her tactical unpredictability. It was her creativity. Where the rest of us saw a classroom full of educational equipment, Maya saw an arsenal waiting to be activated. The periodic table display became a handful of chemical samples that, when mixed with the fire suppression foam, it created a slippery mess that sent raiders sliding into walls like cartoon characters. The gravity simulation device, designed to teach students about planetary physics, became a localized field generator that made one raider suddenly weigh 3 times normal mass. She even weaponized the lunch period announcements, and somehow reprogramming the facility's communication system to broadcast a feedback frequency that interfered with Zephyrian neural implants. Half the squad was stumbling around like they'd been drinking fermented fruit juice. "This is impossible," the squad leader roared, trying to coordinate his increasingly confused and injured team. "Our intelligence reports said this was an educational facility. Nothing but soft targets and academic personnel." Maya emerged from the foam holding what appeared to be a teaching aid about molecular structure, except she'd somehow turned it into a device that was generating enough electromagnetic interference to scramble their targeting systems. Her hair was messed up, her school uniform was torn, and she had that particular expression that I now recognize as a human solving problems in the most violent way possible. "Your intelligence reports," she said conversationally, like she was discussing the weather rather than systematically dismantling a squad of professional killers with classroom supplies, apparently didn't account for human ingenuity. And that's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. Maya wasn't just fighting back against impossible odds. She was winning. Against superior numbers, better weapons, advanced armor, and years of military training, she was actually winning, using nothing but educational equipment and what appeared to be a complete disregard for the laws of physics, common sense, and basic self-preservation. But here's where the story gets really interesting, and by interesting I mean absolutely terrifying in a way that would make existential philosophers weep with joy. Maya, having successfully turned our classroom into a disaster zone that looked like a tornado had gotten into an argument with a chemistry set, suddenly stopped fighting and turned to address the rest of us. We were still huddled in the corner like a collection of very scared houseplants, watching her demolish trained killers with school supplies. "Okay, everyone listen up," she said, stepping over an unconscious raider who was probably questioning his career choices. "I need your help." "Help?" The Deathworlder, who had just single-handedly defeated a squad of professional murderers using nothing but classroom furniture and academic enthusiasm, wanted our help? "I can't be everywhere at once," Maya continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that she'd just violated several laws of nature and at least 3 military treaties. "There are more of them in the facility, and I need you all to stop being victims and start being survivors." Tikri, who had spent the entire battle making noises like a deflating balloon with anxiety issues, raised one trembling appendage. "But we're not warriors. We're students. We study theoretical mathematics and applied philosophy." Maya's smile was the kind that probably made natural selection take notes. "Perfect. You understand systems thinking and logical problem solving. That's exactly what we need." And then she started teaching us. Not quantum mechanics or galactic history, but something infinitely more practical: how to not die horribly in the next 20 minutes. "Plixnar, you're small and quick," she said, pointing to the terrified Mepian. "You're going to be our scout. Use the ventilation system to move between rooms and report enemy positions." She handed him some kind of improvised communication device that looked like it had been built from spare parts and pure determination. "But I don't know how to be a scout." Plixnar squeaked. "You know how to observe and report data, right? Same principle, just with more running and hiding involved." The Gorlaxian twins, Bok and Gok, were assigned to be our mobile fortifications. Maya had somehow figured out that their natural rock-like hide could deflect energy blasts, and their impressive mass could be used to create cover for the rest of us. "Your species evolved on a high-gravity world with constant seismic activity," she explained to them like she was discussing their favorite food instead of military tactics. "You're naturally built to withstand impact and provide stability. Use that." Even Tikri got a job. Maya had noticed that Zophonians could change their skin color for camouflage, something Tikri had been doing unconsciously out of fear. Instead of hiding, Maya taught him how to use it as active camouflage, making him our infiltration specialist. "But this is insane," I protested, watching her turn our study group into some kind of improvised resistance cell. "We're academics, not soldiers." Maya looked at me with those terrifyingly calm human eyes. "Crixtal, your species has 3 hearts and enhanced reflexes. You process information faster than most combat computers. You're going to coordinate our movements and predict enemy tactical responses. I don't know anything about military strategy. You know game theory, right? Optimal decision trees? Resource allocation under pressure? Congratulations, you know military strategy. You just called it by different names. And somehow, impossibly, it started working. Under Maya's guidance, our little group of terrified academics began moving through the facility like we actually knew what we were doing. Plixnar scurried through air vents, providing real-time intelligence. The Gorlaxian twins created mobile cover points. Tikri used his camouflage to disable equipment and create diversions. And I found myself actually thinking tactically, analyzing Raider patrol patterns and predicting their responses like they were variables in a complex equation. Maya had somehow taken our academic skills and weaponized them, turning theoretical knowledge into practical survival tools. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. It was working. And it made me realize that humans didn't just survive on their death world through strength or violence. They survived by turning everything, including other people, into solutions to problems that shouldn't have solutions. Our improvised resistance movement culminated in the main hall, where we discovered that the Zephyrian raiders had made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that conquering an educational facility would be like raiding a library, lots of valuable information, minimal resistance, and everyone too civilized to fight back effectively. They hadn't planned for Maya Thompson. The main hall was a disaster zone that looked like someone had tried to redecorate using high-explosive ordnance and poor judgment. Blast marks scorched the walls, emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, and the central holographic display that usually showed peaceful scenes of galactic cooperation was now flickering between images of structural damage and evacuation routes. The remaining Zephyrian forces had fortified themselves behind overturned furniture and portable shield generators, creating what they probably thought was an impregnable defensive position. Their leader, a particularly large specimen who looked like he bench-pressed small asteroids for recreation, was coordinating the final phase of their operation with the kind of professional confidence that comes from never having lost a battle. Resistance has been minimal, he reported into his communication device. The facility will be secured within the next 10 minutes, beginning extraction of high-value targets. That's when Maya kicked in the main doors. Not opened them, not unlocked them, kicked them. The reinforced metal panels, designed to withstand emergency decompression and direct weapons fire, flew off their hinges with a sound like thunder having an argument with a construction site. The Zephyrian leader stared at the doorway where a small human female had just demonstrated the kind of casual destruction usually associated with heavy machinery. What in the seven hells is that thing? That, I said with growing pride and terror, is a human having a really bad day. What followed was less a battle and more a masterclass in applied violence with a minor in creative problem-solving. Maya charged into the hall with the kind of reckless determination that made physics professors weep and military strategists take notes. The Zephyrians opened fire with enough concentrated energy to vaporize a small building, but Maya was already moving, while using the architectural features of the hall like they were personally designed for her convenience. She bounced off walls, slid under energy blasts, used decorative pillars as cover, and somehow managed to be everywhere the enemy fire wasn't. When a plasma bolt caught her shoulder and burned through her uniform, she didn't scream or collapse. She just got angry, which turned out to be significantly more dangerous for everyone involved. Impossible. The Zephyrian leader roared, watching his professional killers get systematically dismantled by someone who should have been dead 3 times over. Nothing survives direct plasma contact. Maya's response was to grab a piece of broken ceiling panel, use it as a shield to deflect incoming fire, then hurl it like a discus at the enemy's portable shield generator. The device exploded in a shower of sparks and broken physics, leaving half their defensive position exposed. But here's where our academic training finally paid off. While Maya kept the enemy focused on her impossible survival skills, the rest of us implemented what she'd taught us. Plixnar had mapped every ventilation shaft in the building and was dropping improvised explosives, which were actually just chemical combinations from the science labs, into enemy positions from above. The Gorlaxian twins had positioned themselves at strategic choke points, using their natural armor to create mobile cover that allowed us to advance without being turned into academic paste. Tikri was using his camouflage abilities to sabotage equipment and create confusion, appearing just long enough to disable a weapon or communication device before vanishing again. And I was coordinating everything from a central position, treating the entire battle like a complex logistics problem with potentially fatal consequences for incorrect answers. Squad 7, focus fire on the central target. The Zephyrian leader commanded, trying to bring overwhelming force to bear on Maya. Negative effect. I reported to our team through the improvised communication network Maya had built. Human resilience factor exceeds expected parameters by approximately 300%. Maya took a direct hit from a military-grade energy weapon that should have reduced her to constituent atoms. Instead, she stumbled backward, shook her head like she was clearing away mild confusion, and kept fighting. The burn mark on her arm looked painful, but she treated it like a minor inconvenience rather than a potentially fatal wound. "This is impossible," one of the raiders screamed. "Nothing biological should be able to withstand that kind of damage." "You clearly," Maya replied, grabbing what remained of the central information kiosk and using it as an improvised battering ram, "haven't met many humans." The final turning point came when the Zephyrian leader, frustrated beyond reason by watching his elite forces get defeated by educational equipment and pure stubbornness, made the mistake of challenging Maya to single combat. He was twice her size, covered in military-grade armor, and armed with weapons that cost more than most planets' gross domestic product. Maya's response was to accept the challenge, disarm him using what appeared to be advanced knowledge of leverage and joint mechanics, and then pin him to the ground using a combination of human wrestling techniques and a broken desk leg. "I surrender," the leader gasped, staring up at the small human who had just systematically dismantled his entire operation using nothing but determination and creative violence. Maya looked around the ruined hall at the defeated raiders and her terrified but victorious classmates, and said the most human thing possible. "Does anyone know if the cafeteria is still serving lunch? All this fighting made me hungry." In the aftermath of what historians would probably call the incident, where a human single-handedly redefined military tactical theory using classroom supplies, the Centauri educational complex looked like someone had tried to redecorate using explosives and very poor judgment. Emergency crews swarmed through the facility. Medical teams tended to the wounded raiders with the kind of professional confusion that comes from treating injuries caused by weaponized educational equipment. And security forces stood around looking like they couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Maya sat on the steps of the main hall, calmly filling out what appeared to be an incident report while medics fussed over her various burns and injuries. She kept insisting she was fine, which only made them more concerned because apparently fine. For a human included things that would hospitalize most other species for weeks. "I still don't understand," I said, settling down beside her with my 3 hearts still beating faster than normal. "How did you know what to do? How did you turn all of us into soldiers when none of us had any military training?" Maya looked up from her paperwork and smiled, the same polite expression she'd worn during Professor Quindara's terrible jokes about molecular bonding. "I didn't turn you into soldiers, Crixtal. I just helped you realize you were already problem solvers. Military tactics are just problem solving under pressure with potentially fatal consequences for wrong answers. But the way you fought, the things you did, that wasn't normal academic behavior." "No," Maya agreed, wincing slightly as a medic applied some kind of healing gel to the plasma burn on her shoulder. "But it wasn't abnormal human behavior either. We're adaptable. When presented with a problem, we find solutions using whatever resources are available. Sometimes those resources happen to be classroom furniture and terrified classmates." Tikri approached us cautiously, his skin still flickering between colors as his camouflage system tried to process recent events. "The stories about humans being dangerous Deathworlders, they're true, aren't they?" Maya considered this seriously, which was somehow more terrifying than if she'd just laughed it off. "I suppose they are, in a way, but not the way you think. We're not monsters who enjoy violence for its own sake." We're just really, really good at surviving impossible situations and protecting the people we care about." She gestured toward the defeated raiders being led away in restraints. Those Zephyrians were professional killers with superior weapons and training. But they made one critical mistake. "What's that?" I asked. "They threatened my classmates," Maya said simply. "Humans have this annoying tendency to get unreasonably stubborn when people we like are in danger. It's a design flaw from evolving on a world where everything was constantly trying to kill us. We learned to be protective of our groups because cooperation was the only way to survive." Professor Quindara finally recovered from his neural disruption and sporting a bandage that made him look like he'd lost an argument with a medical textbook. He approached our little gathering. "Miss Thompson, I believe I owe you an apology, and possibly a recommendation for advanced tactical studies." Maya laughed, a sound that was surprisingly normal after everything we'd witnessed. "I think I'll stick with quantum mechanics, Professor. It's much less likely to result in property damage." Looking around at the wreckage of our peaceful educational facility, at my classmates who were already comparing stories and laughing about their newfound combat experience, I realized something important. We'd been wrong about humans. They weren't monsters. They were just very, very good at making sure monsters lost. 3 months later, Maya Thompson still sits in the same spot in Professor Quindara's classroom, though we've upgraded her to a desk that's supposedly rated for Deathworlder stress responses. She still takes notes with that ancient human writing instrument, still nods politely at terrible jokes, and still looks about as dangerous as a wilted flower. The difference is that now we know better. The stories about humans being terrifying Deathworlders weren't wrong, exactly. They were just incomplete. Yes, humans come from a world where everything tries to kill them on a daily basis. Yes, they have reflexes that can accidentally destroy furniture and biological systems that let them survive injuries that would kill most other species. But what the stories never mentioned was why they developed those abilities. It wasn't for conquest or domination or the simple joy of violence. It was for protection, for survival, for making sure the people they cared about made it through another day on a world that was actively hostile to life itself. The irony isn't lost on me that we spent weeks terrified of the very being who would risk her life to save ours. We saw her strength and assumed malice. We witnessed her resilience and feared aggression. We watched her turn classroom supplies into weapons and never considered that she might use those same skills to defend rather than attack. Now, when Maya raises her hand to answer a question, nobody flinches. When she stands up quickly, we don't dive for cover. When she smiles, we smile back instead of calculating escape routes. Because we've learned the most important lesson about humans that the stories never taught us, they're not dangerous to their friends. They're only dangerous to the things that threaten their friends. And honestly, that makes me feel safer than any force field or security system ever could. Though I still recommend reinforced furniture, just in case.